All right, welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin Unit 6.5, Economic Imperialism, with our objective being to explain various economic factors, how the various economic factors contributed to the development of global economy between 1750 and 1900. And here's a look at the overall standards for this unit topic presented by the College Board. So today we're really just going to talk about China, all right? China during this time period. So if we're looking at China, right, and England's justification for imperialism, right, or economic imperialism, is occupation to protect free trade, right? So England will go to war with China to protect free trade. And of course, a lot of the story has to do with opium, right, in the Opium Wars. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Your Strayer reading is pretty well detailed about the ins and outs of all this. In class, I simply take a few minutes and we just go over some of the economic issues that are at hand. And we're really talking about, trade between England and China. When we're talking about trade balances, trade deficits, and this is a real short little selection, right? Short little selection, from the Qianlong Emperor from the Qing Dynasty in his letter to George III, after the McCartney mission went in 1793 and to attempt to open up free trade with China and failed, right? So this period of time, from 93 until the 1840s, sometimes referred to as the Canton system. Canton, if you're probably familiar with that word because of the Cantonese language that is spoken in that region of China. And so this is mainland China, just across the bay from the island of Hong Kong. Right. So what do we see here? We see an attempt to open up trade, and we see the reaction, right? So when you look at this, the question we do in class is, read this passage and tell me what the Emperor of China does not want to trade with England, right? So hopefully you can take a minute and do that. All right, so welcome back. Pick up on this object strange and ingenious. Think things like, mechanical clocks, right? That would fall into that category. And of course, your country's manufacturers. Of course, what is England known for, or increasingly known for by the time we get to the late 1700s, early 1800s, they're a manufacturing company, right? A manufacturing country. So the Emperor of China is saying, we don't want, what you're actually producing. And this creates an issue because, right, so what does England want from China, right? Obviously, England, China doesn't want anything that's actually being made. So what does England want from China? And the standard answers throughout most of history of what everyone wants from China are your high-end luxury items like your lacquered furniture, your silks, your porcelains. Now, those things could all be acquired elsewhere by this point in history. Porcelain could be acquired through the Middle East, could be acquired through Japan. Silk was being grown in South Asia and the Middle East. But the one thing that China had a monopoly on in the late 1700s, really until we get into the beyond the mid 1800s, is tea, right? So China still has a monopoly on tea. Eventually, British and Dutch plantation owners are going to be able to create plantations in historic Ceylon, what is today Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, South Asia. You will see tea plantations eventually after the Opium Wars, but China has tea, right? So then the question becomes: England wants tea from China. China wants nothing from England. So what does England have to give China, in order to acquire this tea? So this is another question. Just as a real quick review, what has China always been more than happy to accept from foreigners? And the obvious answer is silver, right? So then this becomes a question of, if you have a trade deficit, between your countries, so You've got silver flowing into China. You've got tea, which is a consumable. No. So you have value, permanent value going into one country. You have non-permanent value coming out of that country. That is definitely an example of a trade deficit. So can a country, or how long can a country maintain a trade deficit against another country? So in class we'll talk about that, give some historical examples of where that happens, and what the consequences are of prolonged trade deficits. Right. So obviously, England found a workaround. So this is when you're going to start to see the large scale, and this also it coincides with the increasing presence of the British East India Company in South Asia. You're going to start to see the smuggling of opium into China. So the opium will be smuggled in exchange for silver, and then silver will be used to legitimately purchase tea. Right, and then tea can then be exported back to Europe. Right, so we're seeing that process take place, during this chunk of time right here. Right, so the smuggling of opium in, and by the time we get to the 1730s, you've got your opium war. Opium will be banned. You're going to see some opium is destroyed. This eventually is going to result in the war being waged, then resulting in the Treaty of Nanjing. So, all I really want to make sure you understand, because the reading does break this down, is that you need to understand the different moving parts and be able to kind of compartmentalize what's happening during these times, right? So this is that time, the Canton system time, where China has control over what's coming in and out of its country, right? There is smuggling going on, right? Opium is coming in, but it's technically China does have the right to refuse, right? It does have the right to say no. Once the Opium War is fought, then we get the Treaty of Nanjing, and this is a good example of one of those unequal treaties. And I'm going to kind of show you I have a slide here that I'm going to show you in a second that'll run through what we mean by that. So your extraterritoriality, stuff like that. All right. So once we get to 1842 and the Treaty of Nanjing, then China no longer has the right to control the points of where trade is coming in. So England has spheres of influence, or a monopoly on who can trade with China in that port, and also England can choose what is traded through that port. So you're going to see a real intensification of opium coming in during this time frame. And then, of course, as all this is going on, you now have a civil war breakout. And lasts for the better part of 15 years, right? So we have a 14-year civil war known as the Taiping Rebellion. I've got a slide, and we'll talk about that in a minute, right? So once we get beyond the Taiping Rebellion, this is an interesting time period, because you really have, Dowager Empress Cixi. And the way it's spelled in Australia is Cixi, Cixi. And she's a really interesting case study. She will kind of usher in China through this self-strengthening time period where China will try to industrialize and China will try to modernize, all the while where they're being carved up into different spheres of influence by multiple European or Western powers. And then eventually they're going to lose in the Sino-Japanese War, and there's going to be another sphere of influence that gets established by the Japanese. Then you're going to see the 100 Days Reforms, right? So, and then this period kind of wraps up with Empress Cixi supporting the Boxer Rebellion, and the Boxer Rebellion being crushed. So I'm just going to spend a minute on each of these little things and just kind of show you some basic slides on this. So to start with the Treaty of Nanjing, this is a quick little breakdown of the Treaty of Nanjing and what happens here. And also, I would highly encourage you to watch the video that is also on this website, the one on the Opium Wars. It's a nice little breakdown. It also does mention the rise of HSBC, the Hong Kong Singapore Banking Corporation, and how they got their start through financing the opium trade. So it's a really good little 10 minutes. So I'd highly encourage you to watch that. All right. So we have the Treaty of Nanjing, right? And this is talked about in the video as well. So what does England get out of the Opium Wars? They get Hong Kong, for one thing. You have reparations, right? Compensation being paid for the destroyed opium that initiated the war. Extraterritoriality rights, right, which we see during this time period, like with the Treaty of Kanagawa in Japan. We also see this with the French and the British in the Ottoman Empire. Christian missionaries are allowed in, and then this is the beginning of our spheres of influence time in China, right? So when you see this kind of image, this is a reference to the spheres of influence that the multiple European powers and the United States are gonna, and Japan are all gonna take, right? So we've got England here represented, Germany, right? Russia, the United States, and Japan are all being represented, carving up China in that image, right? And you can see what happens very quickly after the British Empire gets their sphere of influence. A lot of other countries are going to jump on. So the United States, and this is why the United States will comprise about 10% of the opium that gets sold into China during this time period. We'll have our own sphere of influence there, right? The French, the Scandinavians will come in, the Russians will come in. In 95, we see the wrapping up of the Sino-Japanese War, and the Japanese will come in. And then we see the Boxer Protocols, and and the Dutch are not going to get left out. So there you go, the Dutch. Where is it? Netherlands. There you go. Kingdom of the Netherlands. All right. So anyway, let's just kind of look through. This is just a map showing the different spheres of influence. A couple of them anyway. All right. So as far as Taiping Rebellion is concerned, what do we really need to kind of get out of this? One is that it's a very bloody rebellion, right? So I've seen numbers as low as 20 million dead, as high as 40 million dead. What are we actually kind of talking about here? So this is a kind of a Christian movement, and you can see what they were advocating, right? In addition to Christianity. Equal distribution of land, so giving land to peasants, industrialization, democracy, and then prohibitions on foot mining, slavery, opium, tobacco, alcohol. Right. So this is a movement that does try to use Christianity to try to get Western support, and largely fails to do so. And this raged in southern China. So, what do you really need to get out of this? Besides the death toll kind of thing, is it's a very bloody, nasty civil war. Entire villages and cities were destroyed during this time frame. But as far as how this could be applied on a possible SAQ or LAQ or something like that, probably the easiest way is to try to use this if a migrations question were to come up. When we talk about migrations, we talk about push and pull factors. So we're talking about, for example, Chinese migration to North America. Right. So for one thing, there's going to be push factors that push people out of China, and there's going to be pull factors that pull people towards North America. Right. So this could be considered a push factor out of China. When you get a devastating civil war breakout in a country, a lot of people are going to flee from the chaos, right, from the turmoil. So this is a major push factor for migrants everywhere, not just North America. But whenever you talk about large-scale Chinese migration to Hawaii, for example, for the plantations, right, the sugarcane plantations there, push to Southeast Asia to work on the rising tea plantations, in the sago palm plantations that are rising up there, the cinchona tree plantations. So this is a major push factor. That's probably one of the better ways or easier ways you might be able to use the Taiping Rebellion as a specific historical example if a migrations question were to come up, all right, as a push factor. All right, open door policy. So this is a word that does pop up every once in a while, and really this is just an idea. It's an idea where people are moving away from this notion of spheres of influence. So why should only England be able to trade in Hong Kong, in the Canton region? Why shouldn't every country be able to do this? Right. So this is an idea of opening markets to everybody. Right. So maybe proto-globalization. Right, might be how you want to look at something like that. As far as the Boxer Rebellion, you can view this as an example of a Chinese nationalist movement, Chinese nationalism. And so what are they, what is their motto, right? So support the Qing, exterminate the foreign devils. So we see who the foreign devils being referenced are by who comes in and suppresses the Boxer rebellion. So they're anti-imperialist, anti-foreign, anti-Christian. They will take over Western corporate property. And this is largely the justification that gets used by the Western powers in Japan, to invade, right? And so, like, for example, the U.S. Marines are sent in, partially to protect Standard Oil Company property, right? So the money that had been invested in China there. So we're not just talking about an invasion by Western countries on the coast. This is an invasion and an occupation. Soldiers will march their way all the way to Beijing, right? In rebellion to put it down. And of course, this kind of wraps up the kind of public life of Emperor Shiji. And I did put a link on Google Classroom to a New York Times article. Here it is, just so you can kind of look at it. Sometimes it's easier just to Google these things. And this is just looking at who she was, and basically she is presiding over, or at least is part of this entire story. The whole time that she's in power, and then after power, and then of course her legacy is becomes a challenge to some degree, or tarnished a little bit, because she does support the Boxer Rebellion. Right, so that is that. All right, so so once again, let's wrap this up. So I'm going to just kind of skim through all this because I've already gone over this. Sometimes certain classes I don't make it through all this, but I know I've already talked about these in the videos. So I'm just going to scoot through. You're welcome to pause and look through any of these if you're quick. All right, so let's wrap this up. All right, so key takeaways: industrialization, imperialism are intertwined. Imperialism impacts states; they're not directly taken over. It draws connections between historical events and the processes themselves. Make sure you're able to do that. So imperialism looks different depending upon the area, natural resources, markets usually play kind of key roles in it. And then economic imperialism, right? So opium wars. Also think like, the United States involvement in Latin America in multiple cases, right? So United Fruit Company, right, would be a good example of that. Hawaii is another good example of economic imperialism. All right. So so use of military force at times, natural resource extraction being preserved by largely transnational corporations. And in the case of the Panama Canal zone, when negotiations failed, right, we ended up taking over that zone, and actually creating a coup d'etat, right, from over Colombia, and then supporting separatists in creating the country of what is today Panama. All right, so that is all for today. Sapriati.